nobody ever said it to his face. That was the particular cruelty of it. No neighbor in Nazareth ever stood in the marketplace and accused Joseph the builder of raising a household built on a lie. No one needed to. The silence itself was the accusation, held in glances that lingered half a second too long, in conversations that paused when he entered a room and resumed a beat too quickly when he left, in the careful, deliberate politeness that people extend to someone they have already quietly judged and are simply waiting to see proven right. Joseph knew. He had known since the night the angel left his dream, and he woke up and made his decision and married a pregnant woman whose timeline did not add up to anyone doing the math in a village of 400 people. He had decided, that night, to live the rest of his life inside a story that looked wrong from the outside and was entirely right on the inside, and to never publicly explain the difference. For the next 30 years, every transaction, every milestone, every small public moment of his family's life would be read by his neighbors through the lens of a suspicion he could never fully dispel and never once tried to argue against. To understand what Joseph carried, you have to understand the social system he carried it inside. First-century Mediterranean villages, including Nazareth, operated on what anthropologists studying the region call an honor-shame culture. Honor was not a private feeling. It was a public, collective resource, owned by the family rather than the individual, and constantly at risk of being damaged by the conduct of any member at any time. Shame worked the same way. It did not attach only to the person who acted, it attached to the entire household, retroactively and going forward. This meant that a single questionable event, a betrothal contract followed by a wedding followed within months, by a birth that did not fit the expected timeline, did not fade the way a private embarrassment might fade in a more individualistic culture. It became part of the family's permanent record, available to be remembered, referenced, and reactivated by any future event that seemed to confirm it. Honor could be partially rebuilt through consistent, visible righteous conduct over time. Matthew's Gospel gives us the word for exactly the kind of man Joseph was. Dikaios, righteous just, in Matthew 1:19. But honor-shame systems do not offer full rehabilitation easily. A family under suspicion remains, in some permanent sense, a family under observation, even decades after the original event, even when every subsequent year has produced nothing but ordinary, faithful living. Joseph understood this completely because he had grown up inside the same system that was now watching him. The timeline itself was simple enough for anyone to calculate, and in a village this size, everyone had calculated it. A betrothal contract, signed and witnessed, binding under Jewish law as a form of marriage already in force, even before the couple began living together. A wedding that took place after Mary's pregnancy was already visible. Matthew 1:24-25 tells us Joseph took her as his wife, but did not consummate the marriage until after the birth, meaning the visible timeline to outside observers would have shown a pregnancy clearly preceding full cohabitation. And then a birth in Bethlehem, away from the village, followed by an extended absence, the flight to Egypt, the return only after Herod's death. That meant Nazareth's neighbors did not even get to observe the infant directly for what may have been a year or more. Every piece of that sequence, viewed without the angel's explanation that only Mary and Joseph had received, told one specific story to a culture fluent in reading exactly this kind of evidence. And the story did not need to be retold for it to remain active. In a community where the same families lived beside each other for generations, where children grew up hearing their parents' adult conversations, where newcomers were briefed on the local history of every household within weeks of arriving. The math, once done, was never undone. It was simply held, quietly, available for reactivation. Joseph lived every day of his working life inside a community that had already, years earlier, completed an equation about his family that he could never fully erase, no matter how he or Mary or the children conducted themselves going forward. This mattered for Joseph in a way that went beyond social discomfort. It mattered economically, every single day. A tekton, a builder working in stone and wood, operated in a village economy without formal contracts, without courts readily accessible for small disputes, without any institution beyond reputation itself to guarantee that agreements would be honored. If a family hired Joseph to repair a roof or build a wall or fashion a yoke, the entire arrangement rested on trust. We are stepping into that quiet, decade trust that he would complete the work as promised. Trust that payment, often partial or deferred, would eventually be honored on both sides. Trust that disputes, if they arose, would be settled fairly by community mediation rather than force. Reputation was the only currency that made any of this possible. A man whose household was viewed with suspicion did not necessarily lose all his business. Nazareth was too small for that level of exclusion to be practical. But he absorbed 1,000 small frictions invisible to anyone outside the system. The benefit of the doubt extended a beat more slowly. The willingness to extend credit on a large job shrank a little. The recommendation to a cousin in a neighboring village, the kind of word of mouth that built a builder's working radius beyond his own town, came less freely. Joseph felt this every time he negotiated a job, every time he needed a neighbor's ox or tool on loan, every time his economic survival depended on exactly the kind of unquestioned trust that his family's history made just slightly harder to extend. This may be one reason the construction boom at nearby Sepphoris mattered so much to a man in Joseph's position. Herod Antipas's massive rebuilding project, 4 miles from Nazareth, required laborers on a scale the village's internal economy never could. And critically, the relationships on a large urban construction project were transactional in a different way than village work. Contracts negotiated by overseers, wages paid for labor performed, far less dependent on the deep, personal, reputation-based trust that governed every transaction inside Nazareth itself. For Joseph, work in Sepphoris likely offered something Nazareth's internal economy could not: income measured by skill and labor rather than filtered through 3 decades of accumulated local suspicion. It was, in a very real sense, an escape valve, a place where what mattered was whether he could cut a straight line and set a level stone, not whether his neighbors had finished doing the math on his wedding date 30 years earlier. But the fact that he likely needed that escape valve at all is itself the evidence of what Nazareth's internal economy continued to cost him. A man with a fully unblemished local reputation would not have needed to walk 4 miles for fair treatment in the marketplace of his own trade. Every family milestone in this kind of community functions as a data point, read by neighbors for confirmation or contradiction of the original suspicion. Jesus' bar mitzvah at 13, taking on responsibility before God and the community, watched closely, not just as a religious milestone, but as evidence. Did the boy conduct himself as a properly raised, properly observant young man? Or did something in his bearing confirm what people already half believed about the household that raised him? His conduct in the synagogue across the years that followed watched the same way. His unmarried status past the expected age watched, discussed, almost certainly attributed by some in the village to something unusual or even troubling about the family, rather than to anything Jesus himself had chosen. Every one of these milestones offered Joseph and Mary a chance at partial rehabilitation if things went conventionally, and a chance at confirmation of suspicion if anything looked even slightly unusual. And given what we know about Jesus, his precocious temple debate at 12, his apparent failure to marry on the expected schedule, the eventual public confrontation in the Nazareth synagogue itself that some of these same neighbors would one day witness, very little about this particular son's life unfolded in the conventional, suspicion-quieting way that would have given Joseph the clean rehabilitation he might have hoped for. Consider what happened after the family returned from the Passover when Jesus was 12. They had traveled to Jerusalem as part of a Nazareth caravan. The village did not send isolated families on pilgrimage. It sent groups, often the better part of the community, traveling together for safety and company. Which means that when Jesus went missing for 3 days and was found in the temple courts, debating senior religious teachers with an understanding that astonished them, the other families in that same caravan were present for at least the aftermath, the search, the eventual finding, and almost certainly some account of what the boy had been doing in the temple. News like that does not travel slowly in a community this size. By the time Joseph's family walked back into Nazareth, it is entirely plausible that some version of the story had already arrived, carried by neighbors from the same caravan, eager to discuss what they had witnessed. For Joseph, this was not simply a parenting story to be proud of. It was new material entering a village that had never stopped quietly assessing his family. A precocious, unusual 12-year-old who astonished the temple scholars confirmed, for some neighbors, that this household had always been a little strange. Exactly the kind of confirmation the original suspicion had been waiting 30 years to receive. Joseph could not control how that story was told once it left his family's mouth and entered the villages. He could only continue, day after day, doing the one thing fully within his power, conducting himself with total, visible integrity, and hoping it would eventually outweigh everything else. This is the particular helplessness at the center of Joseph's 30 years. He could manage his own conduct with absolute precision. He could pay every debt promptly. He could attend synagogue faithfully. He could raise his other children, James, Joseph, Judas, Simon, and the unnamed sisters, according to every expectation Nazareth held for a devout household. He could, in short, be exactly the dikaios, the righteous man, that Matthew's gospel calls him. What he could not control was Jesus. Not because Jesus was disobedient or difficult in any ordinary sense. Every indication in the text suggests the opposite. A son who submitted to his parents' authority and grew in favor with God and man. But Jesus was also, demonstrably, unusual in ways that a village watching for confirmation of old suspicion would inevitably notice and discuss, regardless of how well-intentioned or even commendable those unusual qualities actually were. A father in Joseph's position could not script his foster son's precocity in the temple, his apparent disinterest in the expected marriage timeline, or whatever other distinguishing qualities marked him as different from his peers as he grew. He could only watch, manage what he could, and absorb the cost of what he could not, knowing that every unusual thing about his most visible child became, in the eyes of a watching village, additional evidence in a case Joseph had never been permitted to argue in public. Joseph does not speak a single recorded word in any gospel. Not to Mary, not to the angel, beyond the implied obedience that followed each dream. Not to the shepherds, the magi, the temple scholars, or, as far as the record shows, to a single neighbor in Nazareth defending his family's honor. Read against the backdrop of 3 decades of quiet village suspicion, that silence becomes something more specific than a simple gap in the historical record. It becomes the visible shape of his entire strategy. He never argued his case. He never explained the timeline to a doubting neighbor, never offered the angel's visit as a defense, never asked Mary to corroborate a story that, even if told accurately, would have sounded to most listeners like an elaborate excuse rather than a confession of an extraordinary truth. He simply lived every day in a way that made the suspicion harder and harder to act upon, even if it was never fully extinguished. This is one of the most demanding forms of integrity a person can sustain, choosing repeatedly over years not to defend yourself even when defense is available, because the only defense you have sounds more unbelievable than the accusation itself. Joseph carried that choice silently for the entire length of his recorded life, in a community that never stopped quietly waiting to be proven right about him. Joseph disappears from the gospel narrative after the account of the family's return from Jerusalem when Jesus was 12. He is not mentioned at the wedding in Cana, where Mary appears prominently. He is not mentioned anywhere during the 3 years of public ministry. Most scholars infer from this absence that Joseph died sometime during the years between Jesus' adolescence and the beginning of the ministry, likely in his own middle age, by the standards of life expectancy in the first-century Roman world. This means Joseph almost certainly died, still carrying the unresolved weight of everything this script has described. He never saw his foster son's identity confirmed publicly at the Jordan River. He never saw the miracles, the crowds, the controversy, the crucifixion, or the resurrection that would eventually transform how the entire world understood the timeline he had spent 30 years quietly defending through conduct alone. He died, as far as the historical record allows us to know, with the suspicion of his neighbors never fully resolved in his lifetime. The vindication he might have hoped for never delivered while he was alive to receive it. That is, perhaps, the most quietly tragic detail in the entire story of Joseph, a man whose patient, decades-long faithfulness was, in the most literal historical sense, never rewarded with the public clearing of his name that the resurrection would eventually provide to history. He simply never lived to see it. Step back now. The honor-shame system that never forgot the original timeline. The math the village had already done and never undid. The economic vulnerability of a builder whose only currency was trust. The relief Sepphoris likely offered from a marketplace that watched him too closely. Every milestone read as a test. The temple's story that outran the family home from Jerusalem and gave the suspicion new material. The things he could control and the son he could not script. The decades of silence that were not absence of feeling but the deliberate, costly shape of his integrity. And the death that came before any vindication arrived. This was Joseph's life, not the brief, triumphant footnote most retellings give him. A 30-year exercise in quiet endurance, absorbed almost entirely alone, in a community that never fully stopped waiting for his family to confirm what it had already decided about them. Here is the quiet truth. If you have ever lived inside a reputation you could not fully repair, if you have ever chosen silence over a defense that would have sounded less believable than the accusation, if you have ever done everything right for years without ever receiving the vindication that would have made it easier to bear, you are standing exactly where Joseph stood. He never got to see the resolution. He kept living with integrity anyway. If this changed how you see what Joseph carried, share it with someone tonight who is living under a judgment they can't fully clear. Subscribe if you want to keep walking through the stories no one tells you. Drop in the comments. What hit you hardest? The math the village never undid? Sepphoris as his escape valve? The vindication he never lived to see? I read everyone. See you in the next one.